Welcome to the Explainer. You know, in the history of literature, there are these moments of just massive, seismic change. Today, we're digging into one of the biggest, that huge shift from the age of reason to the age of feeling. And look, if you're prepping for exams like the UGC Net/JRF, you already know this is absolutely crucial. So we're going to break down all the key facts and theories that really define both the Neoclassical and the Romantic periods.
The whole story we're telling today really boils down to one simple but powerful metaphor. Is the purpose of art to be a perfect mirror, just reflecting the world exactly as it is? Or is it supposed to be a lamp, something that shines from deep inside the artist's soul and lights up the world in a brand new way? Let's trace that incredible journey from the mirror to the lamp.
Okay, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the neoclassical architecture of order, then watch the rise of the novel. And after that, we'll dive headfirst into the Romantic Revolution. We'll wrap it all up with that mirror-to-lamp theory and a dialectical conclusion. Sound good? Let's get started.
First up, the Neoclassical period. You might also know it as the Age of Reason. You have to remember, after decades of chaos, civil war, religious turmoil, what this era wanted more than anything else was just order. And to find it, they looked way back to the classical worlds of ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration.
Now, a really important exam tip. Don't think of this period as one big chunk of time. It's actually split into three very distinct phases. You've got the Restoration, which saw the king and the theaters come back. Then the Augustan Age, which was really the high point of satire and wit. And finally, the Age of Johnson, a fascinating transitional time where you can start to see the first cracks forming in that rigid, rational worldview.
And when we talk about this age, we're talking about these four absolute titans. There's John Dryden, the guy who basically invented modern English literary criticism. Alexander Pope, whose poetry was so sharp and precise it was like a surgeon's scalpel. You have Jonathan Swift, who used satire to just ruthlessly dissect human stupidity. And of course, Samuel Johnson, who literally wrote the book, the dictionary, that standardized the English language.
Let's put Pope and Swift head-to-head for a second, because they were the two giants of the Augustan Age. Both of them were absolute masters of satire, right? But their approaches were totally different. Pope, he used the high, formal style of poetry to attack things like bad writing and the abuse of learning in his work, the Dunciad. Swift, on the other hand, used prose for a much bigger, much more brutal critique of humanity itself in Gulliver's Travels.
But you know, as the Neoclassical period went on, that strict devotion to pure reason started to feel, well, a little cold and restrictive. So a new idea started to bubble up, called sensibility. And this is really the first hint of Romanticism. It put a new premium on emotion, on sympathy, which you can see perfectly in the works of the so-called graveyard poets, who were obsessed with feelings and mortality.
So while all the fancy poetry was following strict rules, something totally new was emerging from the ground up, something that would change literature forever, the novel. It was messy, it felt real, and it spoke directly to a new, rising middle class that was hungry for stories about people like them.
So what was the big idea behind this new form? Well, the critic Ian Watt gave it a name, and this is one you'll definitely want to remember: formal realism. It sounds complicated, but it's a revolutionary idea that literature should tell stories about the individual, day-to-day experiences of ordinary people, not just ancient kings or gods and heroes.
And when we talk about the pioneers of the novel, these are the three names that always come up. You've got Defoe, who gave us this incredible, almost journalistic level of detail. Then there's Richardson, who took us deep inside his characters' minds by telling stories through letters. And finally, Fielding, who gave us these huge, sprawling social comedies, kind of as a reaction to what he saw as Richardson's stuffy morality.
And almost as soon as it was invented, the novel just exploded into all these different types. You had the picaresque novels, all about the adventures of a charming rogue. You had the spooky, terrifying Gothic novels, full of haunted castles and supernatural suspense. And you even had these wild experimental books, like Tristram Shandy, which just blew up the whole idea of how you're supposed to tell a story.
Okay, so all this new focus on emotion and the individual really sets the stage perfectly for the main event, the Romantic Revolution. And make no mistake, this wasn't just a new style. It was a full-blown rebellion against that neoclassical obsession with rules, order, and reason. It was a radical turn inward toward personal feeling, the imagination, and the awesome power of nature.
If you remember one single sentence about Romanticism, please make it this one.
This quote is from the movement's unofficial manifesto. With this one idea, Wordsworth basically tears up the old rulebook. Poetry isn't about logic anymore. It's not about imitating the classics. It's about a powerful, authentic, personal, emotional experience.
It's also really important to know that Romanticism had two distinct waves, or generations. You had the first generation, Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were the trailblazers, exploring the deep connection between the human mind and the natural world. But then came the second generation, figures like Byron, Shelley, and Keats, and they were way more radical, more rebellious, and much more political.
And that brings us to this incredible concept from John Keats, another one you absolutely need to know, negative capability. It is the ultimate anti-Enlightenment idea. It's the belief that the greatest artists don't need to have all the answers. In fact, it's their ability to exist comfortably in a state of uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without always scrambling for facts that makes them great.
And this table just lays it all out so clearly. You can see the unique contribution of each of these major poets. Wordsworth's focus on nature, Coleridge's obsession with the imagination, Byron's creation of the brooding, rebellious hero, Shelley's passionate political idealism, and Keats's pure, almost religious devotion to beauty. Each one of them carved out their own unique space in this new emotional landscape. So how in the world do we make sense of this huge 150-year shift in thinking? Well, thankfully, there's a fantastic critical framework that ties it all together beautifully, and its core ideas are incredibly useful.
So the critic M.H. Abrams, in his legendary book The Mirror and the Lamp, gave us this amazing roadmap. He argued that literary theory basically evolved through these stages. First, art was a mirror, just reflecting reality. Then it became pragmatic. It had a job to do, to teach and delight the audience. But then the Romantics came along with the expressive theory, art as a lamp shining out from the artist's soul. The final stage, which came even later, is the idea that art is just for art's sake.
You can really see the massive change right here. The neoclassical focus was always looking outward, at the universe, at the audience. But the Romantic focus, with its expressive theory, was all about looking inward. It's all about the artist's own genius and feeling. This is the exact moment that primary metaphor for art shifts, once and for all, from the mirror to the lamp.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's really easy to just think, okay, Romanticism came along and killed Neoclassicism. But the truth, as always, is so much more interesting than that. And understanding this nuance is really key to a top-tier analysis. The relationship was what we call dialectical. The Romantics took concepts that already existed in the Age of Reason, like the idea of the Sublime, that feeling of awe and terror in the face of something huge. But they didn't just throw it out. They took it, internalized it, and applied it not to public speaking, but to the overwhelming personal experience of standing in front of a mountain or a storm.
And this whole literary change was really just a reflection of a massive shift in the culture itself. The center of intellectual life moved from the loud, public, rational debates of the London coffee house to the quiet, private, emotional inner world of the individual. The mirror of society became the lamp of the self.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. In our own time, right now, in an age that's so obsessed with data, with realism, with reflecting the world exactly as it is, are we maybe living in a new neoclassical moment? Is the art that matters today more of a mirror? Or are there still lamps out there, shining a light and showing us the world in a way we've never seen before?